Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Freedom Broadcasting Network. I'm Vince Dow, and this week, Republicans taking action against big tech down in Florida. Is it enough, or is there still much more that needs to be done? Also, this administration, as usual, probably making a big, sick joke out of our country, really, on a global stage. We'll give you all the details. And also, 2022, is there good news in store for Republicans? We'll give you the potential indicators why. That and more coming up this week on The National Conservative. So let's start off with the good news this week, because why not? After all, the news cycle can get pretty depressing for a conservative these days. Well, there was a special election this week in Texas's 6th congressional district. This was formerly Ron Wright's seat, who passed away recently. And I know you probably don't care about some obscure special election, but let me tell you the details that matter, and let me tell you why they matter. You don't need to know too much about the specifics of this race, but what you should know is that Republicans vastly outperformed their expectations. Let me give you the numbers here. So, this is a district, Texas 6th Congressional, by the way, with a pretty sizable Latino minority. But in 2020, this is a district that Trump won by only 3%, okay? And in 2020, Ron Wright, who at the time was the incumbent Republican congressional candidate, won this district in 2020 November by 9 points. In this special election that happened this week, Republicans outperformed Donald Trump's 2020 November performance by 22%. Obviously outperforming Ron Wright's 2020 performance by 16%. These are huge numbers. By the way, much larger numbers than any of the so-called election experts and analysts predicted. You don't need to be, good at math to know. 22% since last November. That is a huge change. That is not a statistically insignificant margin. Well, what does it tell you? It tells you this. The energy going into 2022 seems to be very strongly, by very large margins, on the Republican side. And it utterly contradicts all these claims about, how Biden is the most popular president in American history. Obviously not true. Contradicting claims that, Republicans are actually fine with Biden. Biden is uniting the country. Well, actually, you look at the special election, there is clearly a very strong and energetic backlash against the Biden administration. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing, especially because, it is a normal trend, obviously, that whenever an incumbent party holds the White House in those midterms, there's kind of a kickback, there's kind of a pushback. But a 22% pushback, and not saying necessarily that the national environment is going to be anywhere close to R plus 22, but this shows that the energy, the inevitable energy that is on the Republican side, is strong energy. Many experts in the elections business, by the way, predicted before this race that this would be an indicator going into 2022. Now, hilariously, that the Republicans dominated the race, many of those same people are saying that, it's just one race, you can't really tell. That is true, it is just one race, but it does tell you a lot. All right, well, Red Eagle Politics is a political analyst. He runs one of the biggest election prediction channels on YouTube, and he joins us here today to talk about this. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So, you look at this race in Texas 6th District. Republicans vastly outperform their November 2020 margins, also outperform the expert predictions. Where do you think this sits kind of as a leading indicator, as a predictor for what we're going to see nationwide in 2022?
Well, Vince, I think you have to look back to 2017 when we looked at the election that took place in Kansas's 4th district, a district that went Republican by nearly 30 points in 2016. However, in the special election, turnout was lower, but it went Republican by just 5 points or so. And it showed that there was a massive overperformance of Democrats because they were more angry and fed up at the incumbent administration. And this is a historical trend, a historical indicator that we see. And we're seeing the same thing happen now in Texas. And you see massive gains for Republicans, or at least a rebound in these suburban areas in Dallas-Fort Worth that have been moving away from the Republicans for quite some time now because of it.
Absolutely. And, when you look at, there's a lot of sort of factions within the party trying to push their agenda. What do you think nationally should be kind of the ultimate concise Republican message for 2022? Because there's a lot of different ways that you see certain factions in the party trying to approach this. How do you think we should really be going at this?
Well, I think that you have to take the Trump model into account. You can't abandon the economic populism. If you look at what happened in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania across the span of the past couple election cycles or so, the main thing that it shows is that you can't abandon economic populism. The establishment GOP is essentially dead on arrival. You even have Mitt Romney being booed by the Republican Party of Utah, which overwhelmingly elected him just a few years back with the help of Donald Trump's endorsement at the time. So I think that definitely is helping, especially in terms of energizing the base, energizing the rural areas, energizing Hispanic voters, as we see in Texas.
You see, despite all of the Lincoln Project and the sort of CNN talk about the model of the anti-Trump Republican, the Lincoln Project candidate got like what 3%, like basically nothing in that special election we just saw. But another interesting trend you kind of see, especially down in Texas, is that with the Hispanic vote, right? In 2020, you saw massive swings in the Rio Grande Valley sort of region. Some counties like went by like almost 40, 50 points to the right from 2016. What do you think is happening here, and what do you think is driving it, and do you think there is like a sustainable coalition here for Republicans? Because obviously, had the Hispanics not swung so drastically to the right in 2020, it would have been a very close state for Trump, but instead takes it by like 5.8 points. How do you think Republicans sort of sustain this?
Well, I think they have to stick to the Trumpian principles, as we saw in 2016 and 2020. Trump, despite being very tough on issues like immigration, actually outperformed Mitt Romney. And then 4 years later, after he reduced immigration by 50%, he won record numbers among Hispanics in many places. And in some counties, he did even better than George W. Bush did in 2004. So I think that people need to understand that they can't abandon Trumpian principles even in places like Texas, because if you look at the Hispanic population, the demography in these places like Texas, Florida, and Arizona, as you have, third and fourth generation Hispanics assimilating, it's very similar to what we see in the white working class in places like Ohio and Michigan. A lot of these individuals haven't voted Republican ever before, but as we saw in 2016 and 2020, a lot of people decided to switch to Donald Trump because you had an exciting candidate that brought a new message that really wasn't talked about in the party before, and he was able to win some of these areas by massive margins. So if Republicans are going to stick to principle, if they're actually going to stick to populism and traditional conservative values in some instances, they will continue to improve with Hispanics in these places.
It's interesting on the topic of immigration because Republicans often assume that in order to like win the Hispanic vote, they basically need to cave on immigration. They need to get past mass amnesty and things like that. But uh, the polls show it, time and time again. Joe Biden's most unpopular issue with Americans is the border. His most unpopular issue is immigration. And a lot of the Hispanics, that obviously live here and many of them live very close to the border, they're most affected by this issue. And, if we are to really build a coalition, we should actually be mentioning this because it's actually, mass immigration, legal and illegal, that's hurting these communities the most. And yet you look at, for instance, Tim Scott's response to the State of the Union address, basically. How often was the border mentioned? Like once, very vaguely. Like this is the most unpopular issue that Biden has with Americans, and it has to frustrate you, right? The Republicans basically don't mention it nearly enough, I think.
Yes, in fact, Biden in many polls is actually underwater with Hispanics on the issue of the border, on the issue of immigration. And the truth is that a lot of Hispanics want border security. A lot of Hispanics would like lower immigration. It would definitely tighten up the labor market. It would definitely raise wages in a lot of these places on the border in places like Texas. And this is an issue that Donald Trump brought to the forefront in 2016. He continued to talk about it in 2018 and 2020. And as a result, he continued to make gains despite the media making him out to be this evil racist to Hispanics.
So true. All right, ready to go. Thank you very much for
Yep.
coming on, and we'll definitely
Yep.
have you back to talk as 2022 gets closer. So, thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
By the way, here's a detail that I may have forgotten to mention, but I think is very, very important. Republicans did so well in this special election, which was basically a jungle primary, that the runoff election is between two Republicans. The Democrats did not even qualify for the runoff election. Usually, traditionally speaking, in a district like this, and like was the expectation, the Democrat would have come in second place in this jungle primary, and basically, the runoff election would have been between a Republican and a Democrat. No, Republicans did so well that the Democrat couldn't even come in second place. First and second place were both taken by Republicans. Tells you a lot, right? Tells you a lot that the national energy and really the advantage is on our side. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it is a pretty good indicator that things are in our favor at the very least going into 2022. But I would like to emphasize that this is far from guaranteed. We have to capitalize on this. We have to ensure that this happens, and we cannot squander our opportunity. Now, a big way that Republicans can squander this, a big way that Republicans can screw this up, is if we lose sight of the bigger picture. We must remember that while Trump and Trump's personality was great, ultimately the reason why Trump won and rose in the first place had less to do with his personality and more to do with the actual Trump agenda. And don't get me wrong, Trump's personality and image is a big reason why rural turnout increased dramatically for Republicans under the Trump presidency. But ultimately, it was less so Trump's personality and more so the Trump agenda that went into states like Pennsylvania and Michigan back in 2016 and convinced lifelong blue-collar Democrat voters to switch sides. It was the Trump agenda in 2020 that went down into the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas and convinced lifelong Hispanic Democrat voters to vote for Donald Trump. And the reason I bring this up is because as we find candidates and as we craft a message for 2022, we must remember that it is not enough to simply have candidates who may even emulate Trump in personality and certainly, defend Trump and act Trumpian in rhetoric. This is not enough. In fact, it is less important than whether or not these candidates actually stand up for and fight for the Trump agenda when they're in Congress. And the reason I bring this up is due to recent events surrounding the race to replace Liz Cheney. Now, Liz Cheney is someone that we none of us like. Liz Cheney is a top congressional Republican out of Wyoming that notably voted to impeach Trump, and there's been a lot of energy to get her out of office, which I support. But it matters who replaces Liz Cheney. If we are to take Liz Cheney out of office because she's disloyal to our movement, we ought to get someone in office who does support our movement. And who is that person going to be? Well, the person slated to replace Liz Cheney is another House rep by the name of Elise Stefanik. Now, Elise Stefanik is certainly almost guaranteed to win the Republican primary against Liz Cheney because she just got an endorsement from Trump today, which usually is enough to do it. But who actually is Elise Stefanik? Well, Elise Stefanik is someone who, like I said, has been very vocal in support of Trump in terms of rhetoric. And that's great and all, I suppose. But on her actual record, on her actual policy record, she has been against the Trump agenda, and she has been inherently not conservative at all. Let's go over it. So Elise Stefanik, again, the person who is slated to take out Rhino Liz Cheney, right, only has a 71% pro-life rating from the National Right to Life. This is a terrible rating for your average Republican on the issue of abortion. Most Republicans in Congress have much better ratings from this organization than just 71%. Elise Stefanik voted for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act back in 2019, which expands amnesty for illegal immigrants. Time and time again, from several different and varying conservative action groups, it is unanimous that Elise Stefanik has gotten terrible ratings from all of these groups. And these might not be groups that you necessarily 100% agree with, but when you see time and time again, every conservative group is giving her a terrible rating, you have to be like, maybe something is here. For instance, Heritage Action, which, say what you will about the Heritage Foundation, but Heritage Action gave Stefanik only a 56% on her policy record compared to Liz Cheney's 91%. The American Conservative Union scored Cheney at 78% on policy record, Stefanik only 44%. Freedom Works, 37%, policy record in terms of Stefanik, Liz Cheney, 56%. And you might not be fans of some of these groups, but you can this definitely should be raising suspicion in your head, right? Who is this person that is replacing her? The CFG, another conservative advocacy group, gave only a 35% rating in terms of policy, which is the fourth worst in the entire House GOP. Liz Cheney is terrible. Liz Cheney is absolutely someone that we need to get out of office. But this is the person who's going to replace her? Someone who, yeah, cool, stands up for Trump in terms of rhetoric, but has one of the single worst policy records in the entire House GOP? One could even actually make the argument that Elise Stefanik would do worse in Cheney's position than Liz Cheney herself. Why do we settle for candidates like this? I'm not sure who is exactly in Trump's head telling him to endorse candidates like this, but Trump should really fire them immediately. This is not what we want. This is not what we need. And it's not like electability is the issue either. Wyoming is a deep red state. It's going to go Republican regardless. So why not actually put up an authentic conservative candidate? It's not that hard to do. In fact, if you put up an authentic America First conservative, they'd probably do even better than Stefanik or Cheney in the state. It's Wyoming. There is no risk. So I really don't understand the reason why we have to settle for someone like this. And it's kind of unfortunate because Stefanik is most likely going to win pretty easily due to the Trump endorsement. But I'm here to say I'm not happy about stuff like this. And it really does matter because 2022 ultimately is our chance to purge the rhinos. It is our chance to get milquetoast conservatives out of the party for good. And obviously, everyone kind of agrees that we want to take advantage of this. But if we are to do this, we ought to simply go all in. There is no point. In the grand scheme of things, there's very little point in replacing Liz Cheney with someone like Elise Stefanik. You get very little net benefit compared to what you could have gotten. We ought to just go all in. Just pick good candidates. It's not that difficult, folks. And let me say to the people who might think, well, whatever, we can always do this later. No, we can't do this later, okay? Because the grim reality is this. Regardless of who our candidates end up being, it's a reality that, as with the numbers I pointed out, most likely Republicans will do decently in 2022. They're pretty much guaranteed to take back the House no matter who they run. The Senate, up for grabs, but we'll see. But regardless, the reason I bring this up is because I don't think there will ever be this much anti-establishment fervor, this much momentum that we can take advantage of for a very long time. This is our chance. This is our shot. This is our year to do this. And we are squandering these opportunities with candidates like Elise Stefanik. Even if they primary out whoever is the current Republican, once they get into Congress, we're not actually going to see much change from the House GOP if this is what we keep doing. So this is my plea to President Trump, and this is my plea to a lot of Republican leadership who is probably putting this in Trump's head. Please stop. Okay? Please do not co-opt or astroturf the movement against the rhinos in this party. No, let's do it for real. Because regardless of, let's say we do win the election with the rhinos still in power. Fine. But come 2023, what are those people actually going to do in Congress? And you might even say, well, Vince, it's not a big deal because, for the next 2 years after that, Joe Biden is going to be the president. So the only job of the House GOP really is going to be to obstruct the Biden agenda. Sure, that's true. But what happens if we win the presidency in 2024? With a strong candidate, like Trump or DeSantis that we actually like and will actually stand up and fight for these things. What good does it do to have a weak, only slightly better House GOP there that will be basically the Paul Ryan GOP House of 2.0? There's no point to that. Okay? So let's remember this, folks. The Trump agenda. We need to be picking candidates who stand up for the Trump agenda. Nothing more, nothing less. Go all in. That's a pretty good slogan, actually. I think it really ties together this show so well. and especially relating to this big tech bill out of Florida that I promised I was going to talk about. This week, the Florida state legislature finally passed that big tech bill that Ron DeSantis has been pushing for a while. So this is the first real action by any elected Republicans in America to actually do something about big tech. And it's a great bill, and I really applaud Ron DeSantis for getting this done. But I do have one concern with the bill, which is that it does not, while it is a great first step in the right direction, it does not go far enough. So the bill, and don't get me wrong, like I said, it's a step in the right direction, but I'll bring up why I'm kind of concerned that we won't take further steps in a second. But what the bill basically does is it fines social media companies $250,000 a day, which they managed to get raised from $100,000 a day, for deplatforming statewide candidates for office, and there's some protections for other candidates. Okay, but the problem with the bill, the obvious problems are that, well, social media companies are still allowed to suspend political candidates for up to 14 days. So while they might not be able to totally deplatform a candidate, what is the effective difference between deplatforming a candidate 14 days before their election versus just suspending them for 14 days before the election so that they can't use their platforms, right? There's still kind of an obvious loophole here that can be abused. But I think the bigger flaw with the bill is that it only really applies for candidates for office. What of private citizens? What of all of the journalists and political pundits and regular people, all of these people who are equally kind of important in that social media national discourse and really have no protection here? But even beyond that, the bill doesn't really provide protection or a way back for people who have already been deplatformed. And so, like, a lot of important people have already been deplatformed, notably Donald Trump. With this bill, yeah, it stops perhaps future candidates from getting deplatformed, but it really doesn't give any indication that it's going to help someone like Trump, who is a Florida resident, might be running for office again. There's really no indication that this bill is going to help someone like Trump get back onto social media if, say, he wants to run in 2024. And so, like I said, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to knock Ron DeSantis. I love Ron DeSantis. I think it's a great bill. I think it's great that he's taking action on this issue. My concern, however, is that with this bill and basically clone copy bills that you're going to see out of a lot of other state legislatures, a lot of other Republican states are going to basically pass the same bill that Florida is passing right now. My concern on this is that Republicans are essentially going to declare victory once this is done. Ron DeSantis will run for re-election in 2022, which he will win, by the way. Off of one of the things he said, hey, I took action against big tech and I won against big tech. But this is far from a victory. This is simply the first step in a very large, much grander fight that's really going to have to be much more all-encompassing. It's going to go on for a lot of years against big tech. And my concern is that what Republicans will essentially do, both in Florida and nationwide, is they're going to take the big tech issue off of their agenda. They're going to say, well, we got big tech done off the legislative agenda. Let's go focus on guns or whatever else, right? These other issues. And that's my concern. Because what they'll essentially have done is think they won on the big tech issue. It's only the beginning. It's only the beginning. And yet, so many politicians will basically think, well, we did it. We did it, guys. We stopped a big tech, right? But they didn't. So what we ultimately need to be doing is really, after this is kind of all said and done, we need to keep that pressure up, right? And that's my concern here, is that the political momentum basically within these state legislatures for more action against big tech is kind of going to die off. It's going to fizzle out. And that's exactly my concern. And that's why I was kind of hoping that, it's fine if it's just the first bill in a much bigger set of bills. My concern is that it's not going to be just the start of a grander fight. It's going to be the end, right? And so that's the issue I have with this. And that's why I say, go all in. We need to go all in, okay? This cannot simply be the beginning, because it's kind of just a slap on the wrist against big tech. We need to be doing more. And think of it this way, imagine if we kind of got the perfect big tech bill out of all these state legislatures. Obviously, the federal government's really never going to trust bust or do anything in the foreseeable future. But imagine if almost every Republican state essentially passed a bill, not just saying, well, you can't deplatform current candidates, but basically saying you can't deplatform anyone on the basis of political speech, right? You have to protect the First Amendment on your social media platform. So if this were the case, and if every Republican state did this, while there would be no basically federal enforcement against big tech, there would be so many states across the country that are enforcing the First Amendment on big tech that essentially and effectively speaking, we win on the issue, right? We'll have won on the issue because it will be too much. It will be too much legal trouble and too much of a hassle for big tech to be taking on all these different states in the union. If over half the country is basically doing the right thing against big tech, really big tech is going to have to cave on the issue. And we can't do this without the federal government. We can. But in order to do this without the federal government, we need the Republican state legislatures to go all in, okay? And this is my hope. Ron DeSantis is someone who I think really does care about what we have to say. It's my hope that this is just the beginning in a much longer fight against big tech. We cannot declare this as a victory. In fact, I'm kind of scared. I worry about declaring this as a legislative political victories precisely because I worry that will cause Republican politicians who may actually want to take action on the issue. It will cause them to become complacent and think that they won. We have not won, folks. The battle is far from over. All right, well, to wrap up this week, I wanted to share this. So I saw a single tweet. I really laughed at this, but I thought to myself, this really just does sum up the Biden administration in a nutshell. So this is in regards to political events down in El Salvador. Apparently, the National Assembly there has voted to remove a lot of their kind of federal judges. I don't know if that's what they call them in their country, but that's basically what they're doing. They're changing the legislature, the judiciary. Sorry, and I've heard kind of arguments for both sides. I know actually a lot of people in El Salvador are actually very happy with this. We are not really here to take a stance on it, quite frankly. It's kind of a minuscule issue that doesn't affect America that much, and I care about American political issues. Okay, so ultimately, to me, it is frankly irrelevant as to what a country like El Salvador does on the issue of like their judiciary. You know what I mean? I care what our judiciary is doing, right? But anyways, Vice President Kamala Harris, or I should more appropriately name President Kamala Harris, clearly does care. Kamala Harris tweeted out this week, "We have deep concerns about El Salvador's democracy in light of the National Assembly's vote to remove constitutional court judges." And get this, an independent judiciary, she says, is critical to a healthy democracy and to a strong economy. You got that, folks? An independent judiciary is important to a healthy democracy. Yeah, an independent judiciary. Obviously, what she means by that is a court system that's independent of party politics. Coming from the administration that literally just opened up a commission on court packing, whose colleagues in Congress openly call for court packing, and who the Biden administration refuses to condemn. It's like a sick joke almost. These are the people who are calling for an independent judiciary in El Salvador. Wow, here they're literally doing like the single biggest way, easiest way to politicize the court system. Kind of makes you facepalm, doesn't it? And this is really a prime example, despite all of the kind of virtue signaling that this administration does on so-called democracy and how, oh my gosh, democracy is so amazing. And really, on a world scale, the way in which this administration tries to impose its so-called democracy on the rest of the world, honest question, for a long time since the fall of the Cold War, we really have been the world police on these issues. We've been very concerned, and Joe Biden has taken part of this his entire career, in enforcing democracy and in American values around the world. But honest question, you look at something like this. They're calling for an independent judiciary in El Salvador when they don't even want an independent judiciary here, right? You have to kind of look at this and really ask the question. And I'm sorry, I know this almost sounds a little bit unpatriotic to say this, but it's really not. Okay, just hear me out. Who actually are we to tell other countries around the world how to run their democracies or how to run their republics? We can't even run our own republic correctly. I mean, seriously. And this is a prime example of it. Who are we to tell the rest of the world, this is how you got to run a free society, guys. This is how to run look, we support freedom around the world. What freedom do we have in America right now? Honestly, our country is a mess. Our republic is a mess. Okay? Authoritarianism is increasing and increasing in this country, and yet we tell the rest of the world about democracy? Who are we? And, don't get me wrong, I'm someone who generally don't think we should be the world police on these issues. But at least if we are going to be these interventionists, if we are going to be the people that dictate to the rest of the world how to run our democracies, you'd think maybe we should fix our own first, And maybe we should at least have, consistent standards. We're telling El Salvador how to run their own judiciary, but we're not even holding our own country to those same standards. So honestly, just the thought, maybe if, these war hawks basically looked in the mirror and saw, well, I supposedly want to spread all these values across the world, but I don't even support them here. I'm actually trying to destroy these supposed values here. But of course, it's not really about that, right? It's not really about that. The freedom thing, the democracy thing, really just all one big virtue signal. I mean, that's really not the reason why they intervene in foreign affairs. But it's just like, come on, guys. Come on, what's going on here? Fix your own house before you try to fix someone else's. We are not about to have an independent judiciary here. We certainly don't have a healthy functioning democracy here, or more accurately, a republic. No, the country is a mess. So why not fix that mess? Why not fix our mess before we fix the mess of El Salvador, of Venezuela, of Iraq, of Syria? But of course. That assumes that we have leaders and a political elite that actually care about this place, our place. But clearly they don't, right? Anyways, guys, thank you very much for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the National Conservative here on Freedom Broadcasting Network. Be sure to check us out on a regular basis, guys, and be sure to check out all the other great shows on FBN. But with that being said, guys, I will see you next week. I have been Vince Dow. Reminder that you can check me out on social media. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at The Vince Dow. Okay, all one word, at The Vince Dow. And you can check out my YouTube channel, which is simply my name, Vince Dow, if you want to keep up with me. But if not, I will see you next week with another episode of The National Conservative. Thank you very much. God bless. Have a good rest of your week.